and that they may not have an opportunity to get home to their families at the end of the day if they don't follow these rules. And therefore, simply being compliant isn't enough. We always have to do more than what legislation is asking us to do.
Hello and welcome to My Safety Hub, your go-to source for all things health and safety. My name's Dylan Steyn and welcome to a brand new series called Hazard Spotlight, where myself and Okkert will be taking common workplace tasks, breaking them down and analyzing the hazards, the risks, and most importantly, the control measures associated with those tasks and building a conversation around that. If you like this type of content, please consider leaving the channel a like and dropping a comment down below of tasks you would like us to break down next. Now that being said, let's welcome back Okkert Fourie. Hi Okkert, how are you doing? It's great to have you back in the studio. We are starting off with a brand new series, Hazard Spotlight. What do you think about this type of content? What is your expectation like for this?
Well, I'm very excited. Thank you, Dylan. I think it's important that we look at the practicality surrounding, various tasks and activities, especially those that are most commonly found around the world in all the industries that are operational. And hopefully we can provide some sound advice to health and safety professionals and users alike, or the operators of these tasks alike, so that they can take better care of themselves.
Of course, I think that is the purpose of these sessions, is to try and relay as much information as possible. And the safety, or the hazard spotlight rather, in this conversation, we will be looking at hazards specifically and the importance of controlling hazards in that regard. But before we get into that, let me ask you a very blunt question, and we'll start at one of the end stages with risk mitigation, and that is our safe operating procedure. So let me ask you, why are safe operating procedures essential for operations, and how do SOPs mitigate risks?
Well, a two-part question there to start off with, so throwing me into the deep end here. From mitigating the risk perspective, I'd say that, the SOP is important, especially from a communication standpoint, in making sure that the user or the operator or the employee understands not only the process to be applied to make sure that the work is being carried out safely, but also so that they can understand the hazards and the control measures which they need to apply in the process of work. And also it creates an opportunity for the employee or the user to provide their feedback and their insights into whether these control measures which have been suggested from the risk assessment, whether they would actually be beneficial, whether they would actually hamper the process, or whether they would actually aid in mitigating risk successfully. We often forget about the fact that the individuals doing the work are usually the ones that are the experts with regards to the work itself. And we should always provide ourselves the opportunity to say that we're wrong. Mm-hmm. And I know it sounds strange when I say that, but quite often safety professionals would have a top-down strategy where they would push down SOPs to employees without giving the employees the opportunity to actually voice their opinions and to bring their expertise to the table and into the conversation. It should really be an open conversation, and that opportunity for being mistaken or for making a mistake as a safety professional, I really do see it as an opportunity, because if you learn about the perception of the user and how they see the control measures and the risk associated to the task, you can always go back to your risk assessment and review it and make it a little bit more accurate. So the SOP in that sense, for me, is really a two-way street in terms of communication and providing us with an opportunity to just become a little bit more effective and accurate with regards to our risk management processes.
Of course, I hear you. And as we said, the SOP is one of the end products or the end results for risk management, and the content of the SOP is derived from the risk assessment. So when we talk about hazards and risks, as you've now mentioned on the safe operating procedure, we need to first make sure that our risk assessment is up to date. And by doing so, identifying all of those hazards and associated risks. Now, keeping in mind that one hazard has a multitude of risks attached to one specific hazard. But the most important part regarding this whole process is naturally the control measures. And remember, on the safe operating procedures, control measures will need to be relayed to that individual to inform them of what they need to do and what management has done to mitigate those associated hazards. Now, before we move on, I would like to draw up a specific task as we are breaking down a task here. I would like to pull up a task on OSH Online, namely welding operations in general. And I would like for us to have a look at some of those hazards associated with those tasks. Look at the hazards, the risks, and then let's look at the controls before we delve deeper into the final SOP product. Alright, Ockert, so I've pulled up the risk assessment here for conducting a welding job. Let's look at some of the hazards and risks associated with this particular job here. So up first we have a behavior hazard, improper or inadequate fire prevention measures while conducting a general welding job. Then the risks associated with this hazard. Improper or inadequate fire equipment available prevents active response to fire occurrence due to welding activities while conducting a general welding job, causing an uncontrolled fire, resulting in property damage of R1 million and upwards, burn trauma, first-degree burns, third-degree burns, fatalities, and even multiple fatalities. Now,
yeah, so this for me, sorry, Dylan, but
Sure.
this for me is an interesting one. I just want to pause with this hazard and the associated risk before we move on. And I think it's just to create a little bit more clarity for the viewers as well, as towards, understanding what is a behavioral hazard. So that's my question to you. What is a behavioral hazard? What does that mean?
A very interesting question. If we look at the hierarchy of hazards, well, not the hierarchy per se, but the various hazard types, you get different allocations with different categories of hazards, such as physical, environmental, ergonomical, and behavior. Behavior talks specifically towards unsafe acts. These are individuals knowingly doing something they are not supposed to do. That is the definition of what we call a behavioral hazard, because that speaks to harm that employees or persons might cause. They are themselves seen as the source of the danger. Remember, the definition of a hazard here is a source of danger that could cause harm to another. And in this case, it is the individual themselves. Do you agree with that, Ockert?
Yeah, so we're basically saying that people could be the danger themselves, right? So it's an interesting thing to consider, because we know that more than 80% of incidents and accidents are caused due to unsafe acts, poor behavior, persons not considering safety measures whilst performing work. This one specifically for me is interesting. If we're looking at improper or inadequate fire prevention measures while conducting a general welding job, my question then is this really a behavioral hazard, or is this a management issue? Because for the fire prevention measures themselves would be a control measure that would need to be implemented. And if we're saying that it's improper or inadequate, it would tell me that the risk assessment isn't properly done, because we then didn't consider the type of fire extinguishing methods or technology that would need to be applied with a specific job that would need to be carried out. So is it really a behavioral issue? Is it more a management issue? Is it more a risk assessment process issue? I think we just need to be careful when we associate descriptions or definitions to hazards, especially when it comes to things like behavioral hazards, because is it the unsafe or poor application of fire prevention measures? Or is it improper or inadequate in the sense that we didn't provide the user or the welder with sufficient fire extinguishers to be able to extinguish a fire or an uncontrolled fire should it actually start up? So I just think we need to be careful when we consider this, and when we make considerations or add definitions towards different types of hazards as well, because what it does is, for the user, when this pulls through to the safe operating procedure, it means that from a behavioral point of view, we would need to consider a type of communication to adjust that behavior, be it a toolbox talk or a safety talk, a team meeting with all the users in the morning before the work starts or before the shift starts, and saying, well, we need to consider the fact that you may have inadequate fire prevention measures. But that's a risk assessment issue, isn't it?
Well, yes, I can think we can argue it that way. But in my opinion, if we look at this specific hazard, yes, it is labeled as a behavior hazard. But remember, when conducting a general welding job, there are prerequisites that one needs to keep in mind as well. Like when you do any type of hot work, you physically need to take a fire extinguisher, your shields for the sparks and so forth, and place them there. So my argument against that is you need to take that fire equipment yourself as the user or the operator of this specific task. And if you don't, I see that as a behavioral hazard. But I concur with your conclusion there that we need to be careful with the hazard statements when it comes to the communication and that habit forming of the individuals. But let's have a look at the second behavioral hazard and let's see if that provides us with a bit more clarity in this regard. So the second behavioral hazard says improper or incorrect work practices. So that is again something that the user does, conducted while conducting a general welding job. So let's look at the actionable item here. The person is exposed to welding hazards by ignoring good practices of wearing correct safety equipment properly when welding while conducting a general welding job. So here we can see this is gross negligence. That is the unsafe act that was committed here. He's not wearing these correct PPE while conducting the general welding job, which in my opinion is most certainly a behavioral hazard because that is knowingly something he's not supposed to do. Then obviously resulting in the following risks, which leads to fatality or possible legal liability. Does that paint a clearer picture for you, Ockert?
Yeah, so I mean, this one is directly related to, like you've mentioned, negligence. So definitely, a behavioral aspect there that would need to be adjusted. So from a change management perspective, considering that this wouldn't be in the risk assessment unless it's happened before or unless it is happening, and therefore it's a reality on the site or on the premises, you can understand that there's a little bit of communication and coaching, some safety coaching that would need to take place with all the welding operators in making sure that, before the work starts, that they would need to use the correct personal protective equipment in making sure that they can protect themselves. And behind that, you would need a layer of enforcement in the form of a policy, which is obviously signed off by the executives and enforced and obviously communicated by the executives through the SOP, so that if user A, B, C, D, or E neglects to apply the safety measures or controls, be it personal protective equipment, after having been communicated to them through the SOP that they would have to apply it, after they've been trained on how to use the PPE. Welders also need to be certified, so they would have a good understanding as to why they would need to use the personal protective equipment. You would have that policy as a backup to make sure that you can enforce these actions and hopefully get the person to toe the line and fall in line with what the requirements are from a policy and risk assessment perspective as it's been formulated through to the SOP as well.
I fully agree. And very importantly, the policies and procedures play a huge part in depicting your control measures on this risk assessment. Yes, we have legislative requirements, but the legislative requirements on their own might not always be enough to mitigate these hazards that we are talking about now. And therefore, your policy will stipulate why we are doing certain things, and the procedure will stipulate how to do certain things. We'll talk about...
Sorry. That's a good point that I just want to elaborate on as well, which I also think is important because it often comes up in the training sessions that I host. A lot of employers would look at the health and safety legislation which they have to abide by. Doesn't matter in which country it is. And they would want to comply with the minimum requirements of what legislation is asking them to do. And they feel that by ticking the boxes and making sure that they are compliant towards those minimum requirements for their specific industry and the specific metropole where they are, that they would be keeping their employees safe. But just by looking at these number of behavioral hazards that you've got on the screen here for welding operations, we have to remember that where there's people, there's risk,
Sure.
and people will always try and find the shortest route to an outcome or a solution for whatever task they're performing.
It's human
And in
nature.
that respect, yes, absolutely. I mean, I'm the same. If I'm doing work, then it doesn't matter what kind of work it is. I'm always going to try and find the shortcut to try and get the work done as quickly and as efficiently as possible, whilst not letting quality fall by the wayside. And everybody is the same in that respect. But if we know that, and if we understand that, we also have to understand that legislation doesn't necessarily, depending on where you are in the world, but it doesn't necessarily look after the way that people are thinking about the work that they're doing.
Sure.
It doesn't really cater for health and safety culture building. And in many countries, looking at change management in the health and safety scope within the health and safety industry itself is a consideration that isn't very popular yet across the world.
Yes.
We're in South Africa, and in South Africa, it's something that I think is maybe just starting up right now, if I think about the conferences that we've attended recently. But it is definitely something to consider, in the sense that ticking all the boxes and being compliant to legislation doesn't necessarily change the way that your employees are thinking about the work that they're doing. And therefore, you need to reinforce these controls, these suggestions that we're going to look at later on, in different forms. And we've got to try and get the person to change the way that they see the dangers associated to the work that they're doing. And they've got to consider the consequences that they may be exposed to if they don't follow the procedures given to them, and that they may not have an opportunity to get home to their families at the end of the day if they don't follow these rules. And therefore, simply being compliant isn't enough. We always have to do more than what legislation is asking us to do, because that just adds on to good corporate governance, and it creates the opportunity to create a bit of a health and safety culture at work. And if you have happy and safe employees, you have productive employees. So it's a win-win for everybody.
I fully agree, Ogert. Going up and above legal requirements is definitely the way to go. We cannot just simply look at legislative requirements and expect our workplace to be safe. But further to this conversation, a very important thing to keep in mind is now you have an open-minded employer that goes above and beyond just simply legal requirements. And they might even contract safety professionals to assist them. And this safety professional says, but yes, do X, Y, and Z, implement this sign, do this training, go for this SOP session, whatever the case might be. My question is why? Why are you doing all of these things? Why do you have all of these control measures in place? Yes, we know it is to mitigate risks. That is the crux of the matter. But what we find very often, and what I've picked up, is we do all of this, we check all of the boxes up and above legal requirements, and then what happens then? Does that physically impact the working environment? The reason I bring this up is when we select these controls, when we go up and above certain legislative requirements, we need to bring that back to a specific hazard statement. Because we need to know, if we appoint this health and safety representative, this first aider, this firefighter, when we do certain things, we need to know that that will impact number 2, 3, 4, 5 hazards within our risk assessment. And if we can make that connotation between our control measures and hazard mitigation, then I feel we start moving into the realm of effective risk management. Because if you mitigate the risk of the hazard, rather, all the associated risks will fall by the wayside or be mitigated for that matter. Do you agree with that statement?
Yes, I think it's a very important point that you're making. I think two things generally happen with health and safety professionals, which may or may not agree with what I'm about to say. And that is that too often we find ourselves focusing on the activity or the task. Yeah. And we would look at the task with a top-down approach, high-level overview, and we would say, you know what, this isn't a dangerous activity, it's not really a dangerous task. And based on whatever little risk statements we would then attach to the task, and not necessarily the hazards that should be scrutinized, we would then associate controls to that task. And unknowingly, we would be leaving the person performing the work exposed to risk. The second thing that would happen is that safety professionals would quite often catch themselves getting stuck when they consider the risks, and I'm saying risks, multiple, associated to a hazard. And I'm mentioning the word multiple because what I've seen on a number of occasions in the industry and in the field when consulting with clients and employers is that when looking at the existing risk assessments, you would have a single hazard and a single risk statement associated to that hazard. But what we need to understand, and we've seen it now, with the document that you're sharing with us on the screen as well, is that we need to consider, first of all, that a hazard is a hazard. It's a source of danger, and therefore there could be multiple possible negative outcomes when a person and if a person or persons are or is exposed to the hazard. You can drop off a ladder and you can sprain your ankle. You can drop off a ladder and you can break your hip. You can drop off a ladder and break your neck, and therefore you can drop off a ladder, hit your head and go into a coma.
Sure.
You can drop off a ladder and die. And it's all about the possibility of it happening, and with that, the exposure, how many people are actually performing the work. But if we don't focus on the hazard, and if we don't look at what it is that we can do to limit the exposure to the hazard, irrespective of how many people are actually doing the work, and putting layers of control in place, putting barriers in place to limit that exposure, to stop the exposure. If we don't look at the hazard and really think about, the SOP, if we communicate it properly, if we look at appointment letters, if we look at, for welding, which is hot work, a permit to be issued and a specific risk assessment to be conducted for that activity before the work is being able to commence, before it's allowed to start. All of these are layers of defense. And then we've got reactive controls, your fire extinguishers, you've got your first aid equipment as well. You've got your personal protective equipment, which is the last layer of defense. It's the last thing you should consider before you actually let the work begin. And you also need to look at physical barriers, what you can do to isolate the individual from the exposure to the hazard. It's difficult to consider when you're thinking about something like behavioral hazards, because there's a lot of communication that needs to take place. There's a lot of coaching and education that needs to take place with different tools and different methodologies, where, again, the policy and the procedure with regards to the specific control measure becomes so important. And the communication around it becomes so important. So as an example, and I may be, carrying on a bit too long here, but as an example, a person would ask me, why do I need to have a policy for the use of or application of personal protective equipment? Why do I need a policy for training? Why do I need a policy for my appointment letters? Why do I need a policy for my evacuation plans? Why do I need a policy for my firefighting equipment and my first aid equipment? And the list goes on. And the reason is, if you don't have sound policies in place, you would not be able to govern properly. Consider any country. I don't want to go into a political rant, so don't be afraid. I'm not going to go there. But if you had to have a country with millions of people in it and you didn't have sound policies being applied towards its approach towards other countries, its approach towards making sure that people are being kept safe, its approach towards making sure that services are rendered towards the populace, if you didn't have those policies or legislation in place, it wouldn't happen. It just wouldn't be possible to govern that country and its populace properly and safely. And the approach that we've seen many a time when it comes to health and safety is that, again, health and safety professionals, and I'm not trying to slander you guys out there, I value your input. So again, leave comments if you agree or don't agree with us. But quite often we would use the applicable legislation for the applicable region or country that we're in and throw that at the employer and say, okay, well, this is what you need to do. That's a starting point. It's a very good starting point. But you still need to govern that company. You still need to manage the employees. you still have to apply disciplinary procedures when necessary. And that's why we have HR departments and HR policies and IR policies, disciplinary policies. Because without the policy, there won't be a framework within which to apply the processes that are needed to apply. And if I go back to personal protective equipment as an example, if I have a policy and a procedure that explains to me what it is that I need to do and how to do it, and that information filters through from my risk assessment, which obviously the control measure is identified as the personal protective equipment, and we get to the safe operating procedure, and again, the individual doesn't apply that personal protective equipment, these policies and procedures become backup for the employers because it's a method to govern with. And it's a tool to get the individual to understand why they need to wear their personal protective equipment. Because if your policies are properly developed, for example, like the triple P policies that we see from Safety Wallet, and what they're actually applying with all their clients, where there's 126 fundamental policies. Everything that an employer generally has to apply to not only be compliant, but to make sure that the employees are being looked after. And those are just the fundamentals. Those are not even the core triple Ps and the elective triple Ps. So, an employer can sit with 300 policies, and I can understand why there would be a frown and maybe a bit of negativity towards getting policies approved, because once a policy is signed off, it's something that the executive or the business would have to apply. They can't run away from it.
Sure.
But that's a good thing.
Yeah. But if I was an executive and you told me that I need to sign off on 300 plus policies, I'm going to think twice about all of this. Yes, the argument is valid, but is it practical to implement, or not implement, but approve and then obviously implement 300 different policies? How do you think we can go about that more effectively?
Well, there's a short and a long answer. The short answer is, you may be applying whatever it is that's written in your policies already. And very often that's the case. Where I'm sitting right now, if I look into the remainder of the room, I can see, some fire extinguishers and some signage that's been mounted on the walls. And there may not be any policies at the venue where I'm at today. But if you have the policy and an incident happens, something goes wrong, somebody gets hurt, you have something to fall back on so that you can understand what it is that you would need to do to fill the gap. So if your control measure failed, we can start asking questions around the procedure related to that policy. We can start asking questions about the policy. We can start asking questions about the scope and the objectives of the policy. We can look at the application of the procedure. How was it applied? Did it really filter through the risk assessment and the SOP to the individual on the ground? Was the individual on the ground considered when these documents were developed? And if we start asking those questions, we're able to come back to our risk assessment where you are now, and we can make the necessary changes with a framework that's not only considering the legislative requirements, but it's also considering the person. It's considering the human being and the change that needs to be affected or that needs to be made with the individuals carrying out the work. Because again, 80% of the time, it's the person making a mistake, doing something wrong.
Sure. So by the sound of things, if I follow what you're saying here, if an incident or accident happens, if we follow the processes that we've just discussed, having policies, procedures, risk assessment, control measures, and so forth in place, when something goes wrong, when an accident happens, we theoretically can trace that back to a singular hazard, and that singular hazard can be pointed to a specific policy. Is that what you're saying?
Well, you would be able to consider the control measure related to the various hazards that are in the task. And you would need to start asking questions about all of the control measures. If you want to do a proper root cause analysis, you would need to consider all of the control measures and start finding out which ones of those failed. So if we have a fire hazard with welding operations that we're looking at now, and the person got burnt, we would need to understand what it is that went wrong, causing them to burn. So was it a lack of wearing personal protective equipment? And we need to remember PPE doesn't stop the incident from happening. So Therefore, we disqualify PPE immediately.
Of course.
Then we need to consider looking at the hierarchy of control. And I would always want to work top down, starting with elimination, which obviously wasn't done, then looking at engineering and isolation controls, then looking at, the administrative controls as well, and working through them one by one to see where they failed. And if we then can put our finger on the control measures that failed, and I'm saying control measures, multiple again, because quite usually there's a cascade event where multiple things fail all at once.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, we need to go back to our policies and our procedures, and we need to review our risk assessment, because it's quite possible that either these control measures were not properly applied, meaning that the procedure and its policy towards that control measure, whatever type of control it is, was never really considered, was never really studied, it was never read fully, and therefore it was never really applied properly. And it could also be that there was a lack of control, and therefore we didn't really do our risk assessment properly.
Yeah.
And then we bring the human element into it as well. And did we really do our training properly? And at every instance, you would be able to hear that, and unfortunately, this is the case. At every instance, you would hear that there's a management failure. There's a management failure.
Sure.
And the reason why I'm saying that is the employer has the duty to provide a safe work environment. In South African legislation and most other countries' legislation, their statements may vary a little bit, but it comes down to the same thing. We need to do, as employers, we have to do everything in our power, everything that is reasonable, to try and make sure that we provide a safe working environment, and therefore to make sure that the employee can perform their work before we pass the responsibility to the employee to do the work safely and to then look after everybody else that they may affect through their actions or omissions.
Yeah,
So
I agree.
If policies were not properly considered, that's a management failure. If the control measures were not properly applied, that's a management failure. If the risk assessment wasn't properly reviewed, that's a management failure.
Well,
before we get to the task being performed.
I agree, Okert, and I agree with all your statements here, but besides the management failure, that is a policy failure at its core. Because you've now said that is a risk assessment failure, okay? But there's a policy and a procedure for how to conduct risk assessments. So if any one of your control measures fail, you did a beautiful Swiss cheese model video on controls, so you guys can have a look at that. But that cascading effect means that multiple control measures failed. Sure, I'm with you. Which resulted in that that specific hazard coming into contact with an individual or whatever the case might be. But the fact of the matter is, yes, management didn't do what they were supposed to do, and I can promise you in the same essence as you say management, I say employees as well, because it's both sides of the same coin. But at its core, that means that the policy and procedure failed, which means you need to go and review that, because that dictates how we should perform certain functions, how we should go about conducting these risk assessments, implementing these controls, communicating these SOPs, creating that safety culture that we spoke about. So the important bit here for me is that if something goes wrong, the first question you should ask yourself is, which one of my policies or procedures failed? Because that means you are not practicing what you have signed in on your policy to do.
Yes, Dylan, I think, you're kind of hitting it on the spot, with your policy failures. So if we had to draw a line between, let's say, HR and health and safety, you have a leave policy at work, which dictates how many days of leave you have in line with your employment contract. That policy needs to be applied in line with a contract, so that obviously you are making sure that your employment rights and duties and responsibilities are executed sufficiently. So if you have employees that are abusing their leave and you are not implementing that policy as it should be, that's a failure. It's still a management failure. It's 100%. Definitely a policy failure. So that policy would need to be reviewed if it means anything. So sure. as much as what we're saying now, your policies are failing, we also have to really look at the different kinds of control that we apply towards a task. Yes, we've got the hierarchy of control, but I think a very important point to consider is that your hazards determine your controls. And as much as your hazards could determine your control, you would also have to go and verify that those hazards actually exist before you simply sign off a risk assessment and say that everything is fine, because it just doesn't work that way. Your risk assessment means nothing unless you physically go and verify that for the specific tasks or activities being carried out, that number one, the hazards exist. Number two, the control measures exist. Number three, that the control measures are applied. And number four, that the associated behavior that we expect from the employee, remember Unsafe Act, is within the framework that we set the standards with, which again relates back to our policies and procedures.
Yeah, of course, I'm with you. So the hazards on the risk assessments are very important. I'm preaching that this whole morning, that the hazard is the core that we need to mitigate, and all subsequent risks will fall under. And the controls are the powerful tools to mitigate that. But you say here that hazards need to be specific, Okkert. And let's have a look at the screen here on line 12 and 13. On the risk assessment for conducting a welding job in general, we have two hazards here in the form of biological hazards. The first one says the person is exposed to hazardous biological agents like COVID-19 in the air while conducting a general welding job, resulting in a whole bunch of risks. And then number 13, we have another biological hazard, person exposed to safety equipment surfaces contaminated with hazardous biological agents such as bacteria or fungi while conducting a general welding job. You spoke about validity of hazards within a risk assessment. Do you feel that these two are valid for welding jobs?
Well, they may be. They may be. My question is, what type of control would you like to apply?
Well, let's have a look.
For these two hazards.
Let's have a look. Let's open up the fungi one and let's have a look at the control measures that they suggested. So we're on line 13. This is the fungi while conducting general welding job. Let's look at the suggested controls, and we only showed selected ones on this assessment. Here we can see we have things like a Section 8 appointment letter, SOP for conducting a welding job, which is very valid. Then we have admin control, general health and safety induction training. Then we have hygiene awareness as communication on that. And then we have importance of maintaining personal protective equipment. And that's kind of it for this one. So, in my opinion, I definitely feel that there are some lacking controls here, and not absolutely everything was considered to mitigate this biological hazard. What do you think?
Well, to start with, if these controls that are on the screen now are the suggested controls, or call it generic controls,
sure.
I would start off by asking, where's the permit to work?
Mm-hmm.
This is a type of an activity or task that needs to be performed only with the aid of a permit.
But would the permit mitigate that hazard? Okay? I mean, we're talking about a biological hazard while conducting a welding job. Yes, the permit in the bigger scheme of things, but is a permit going to consider biological agents? Is it going to consider those hazards with the permit?
Not necessarily, no. But if we're purely looking at the biological hazards, like you've mentioned now, because I was focusing on the controls now. But if we look at the biological hazards, obviously you would need to bring in things that, if we look at the exposure to COVID-19 being in the air, so obviously the person has to wear some type of face mask, right, whilst wearing a face shield, whilst welding.
Welding on, yeah.
In a time when COVID-19 has kind of subsided, we don't have many reported cases across the world anymore. I just don't think it's practical. Secondly, the person who's making contact with surfaces that may be contaminated with fungi or bacteria, we do that every day. Every single time you go to the bathroom, you're making contact with bacteria. I don't see this being practical for a welding operator to sanitize their hands every single time before they start their welding operations. It's just not practical. Unless something happens. a new pandemic comes along, a breakout of some type of stomach bug in the workplace where multiple employees are sent home. Some of them are hospitalized. Some of them are critical because there's some kind of bacteria or virus that's being spread, some kind of communicable disease that's spreading amongst, all of the employees. Could be related to the water, could be related to food poisoning. And if that is the case, we would have to then consider steps to mitigate those certain cases.
Sure.
But at this point in time, if I had to go to any of our steel manufacturing plants here in this region and start asking them to get their welders to sanitize their hands before they start working, or at every instance before they start welding, I'm going to get chased out the office.
Sure. I think the probability regarding that is very, very low. However, this is not impossible. If we just have a look at line 13, for example, this says a person makes contact with safety equipment such as gloves, helmets, clothing, and so forth, which could have a potential biological agent within them. We've seen this very oftenly where employees share PPE, especially with shift workers. And I'm thinking about an example here. The Drickers and Strickland fight, where Strickland had a staph infection. Why did he have a staph infection? He was using the mat and someone else, touched him, and that caused a bacterial infection. The same could be true. This is now far-fetched, but the same could be true in welding operations. If you take one person's gloves and they didn't, look after their hands, they had a cut or a cyst or whatever on their hands, that could potentially carry over to you. So I do think there is merit to this hazard. However, I agree that the probability thereof is very, very, very low. That is my 2 cents on that matter.
Yeah, look, I agree with you. I think that, there's always a chance. The fun thing about working with risk assessments is that you have the opportunity, and this is going to sound very weird, but you have an opportunity to become an agent of doom.
Sure.
Right? You have an opportunity to look into the future and to see how people can get hurt, how people can get killed, how people can get sick.
Yeah.
And I'm saying that it's fun because you get to imagine all the various ways of how you can make sure that that doesn't happen.
End of the world scenarios, yeah.
There's this question with regards to risk assessments where it's called the impossible question and the impossible answer scenario. If you start asking the impossible questions, and you start getting challenged, like we're doing with one another right now, where I'm saying, it's not relevant, remove it. Take it off the risk assessment because there is no COVID-19 pandemic at the moment.
Sure.
It's possible that PPE might be shared, but let's go and check. And if it doesn't happen, if it's not happening, if it's not a practice that's happening between the employees, take it off the risk assessment.
Yeah.
And if we apply, proper self-management where a person does have some type of infection, they would report it.
Yeah.
But again, let's just start asking the impossible questions first. Let's look at all the impossibilities and give them answers as to how we're going to control those scenarios, because what you're explaining here, it's vaguely possible.
Sure.
It's vaguely possible. It's not something that I would personally want to do. I wouldn't want to share my PPE with someone else.
Definitely not.
Kind of gross. But you brought it up, and I didn't think it would be a practice that people would apply, but maybe there are scenarios where people apply it, and that's an impossible question. So how do you control that? You need a policy and a procedure that dictates the use of the PPE.
100%.
And that you understand that the PPE doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the company. And second of all, you have a duty to take care of that PPE, and taking care of it means partly not to share it with other people who are given their own PPE.
Of course.
And if that's applied practically and managed as it should be, then this hazard can be removed because 100%. Then it doesn't exist.
But the nice thing, as you now say, with being a prophet of doom while conducting a risk assessment, is that a risk assessment is a living document. We do not want the misconception of thinking, I'm going to do a risk assessment one time, and these hazards and risks that are present here are fixed, and these are the controls associated, and this is set in stone. That is not the case. And unfortunately, we still see this happening very often, where guys do a risk assessment, print it out, approve it, and pop it into a file, and off they go. That doesn't serve a purpose with risk management. This risk assessment, we have very valid arguments on both sides on one hazard. Now, imagine the arguments you can have on other things like physical hazards. This risk assessment needs to be continually revised, almost daily, I would go as far as to say, along with the control measures. Things change, people change, things adapt as the job adapts. So with that being said, we need to have a living risk assessment. It's not going to be perfect. I can guarantee that to you. I've never seen a perfect risk assessment. Why? Because things change constantly. Things go up and down, the probabilities go up and down, and maybe you foresee something new. We had massive rainstorms here in our region a few nights ago. I've never thought about flooding, and now all of a sudden, flooding becomes a reality for me. Those are hazards that can continuously change and improve. So,
yeah, well, I mean, you are a new homeowner, so you will get over it. Trust me, that this too shall pass. Don't worry.
Sure.
But you're making a very good point on a few things. So first of all, there's no such thing as a static or stagnant risk assessment because there's no such thing as a stagnant or static workplace. Risk moves up and down continually, all the time. I could be sound of mind today and not be in the same state tomorrow due to things that are happening at home. And my attention towards what I'm doing isn't the same anymore. And risk goes up.
Exactly.
PPE gets worn out and risk goes up. Machines get worn out and risk goes up. Your work environment changes. There's rain. You've got a wet surface where you're operating your forklift and risk goes up. So there's so many different scenarios where these risk levels fluctuate and they go up and down continually. And health and safety professionals, health and safety representatives, managers, supervisors have a duty to consider these aspects and to report whatever there is to report that affects risk so that the risk assessment itself and the associated controls can be adjusted, can be applied, can be communicated continually as risk is moving up and down.
100%. And that is where our probability ratings come into play. I'm quickly just doing a score here based on what we see here. So allergic reaction, we can make that a possible 3. And the probability, we've now said maybe a 2 before control measures. After we implement some controls, we can drop that to a 1. It is important just to reiterate on a few things here, Okkert. When we speak about risks, hazards, and so forth, we need to keep in mind that once we've foreseen something to happen, doesn't matter how far-fetched it is, we're now seeing that, wearing of the gloves and relating to fungal infections can possibly happen, although it's remote. So once we've foreseen something and the severity of that has been determined, we cannot change the severity from before we control to after we control. We can see that I cannot physically edit this one. The reasoning behind this is all the control measures that we implement to mitigate this hazard could potentially not eliminate the hazard completely. Only if we eliminate the hazard completely will this go away by itself. But if we cannot eliminate, the severity will always be there. However, it is the probability that we control with our control measures. So the likelihood, in other words, that these risks will come to fruition. Okay, so that's kind of the scoring, and the reason why I want to bring that into play here is you brought about another important point on the control measures. So now, what happens if we have all of these control measures and the employer decides, listen, I'm not doing this? What happens to this risk assessment then?
Well, first off, if the employer decides that certain control measures will not be applied or purchased for application, naturally the risk level associated to the task as a whole would need to go up because you have a hazard that exists and that hazard is now not being controlled. So obviously the risk level goes up, and now the employer would have to answer a very important question, which is very much associated to how much they value their employees.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. And that question is, do I care about my employees?
Of course.
Do I care about the person performing this task? Because if we look at controlling the biological hazard that you have there, you've got hygiene awareness on the right hand side, which may bring down the probability rating a little bit.
Sure.
So if we're not going to apply hygiene awareness, or if we're not going to purchase an engineering control, which is very expensive, we have to understand that we are leaving the person doing the work exposed to risk. And this is a legally binding document, the risk assessment. And if an investigation had to ensue, questions would be asked.
Of course.
So I think it's important that when we conduct a risk assessment and we identify a biological hazard, we would need to go and search for associated controls to mitigate that hazard, and not simply take whatever suggestions there may be and to work with that as is. We've really got to think about, the hazard. We've really got to go and think about multiple controls associated to the hazard, and there could be multiple hazards in a task.
Yes.
And really start answering questions. Now, the nice thing about this is if you follow this process correctly, you will find that there will be control measures that will essentially overlap, where a single control measure may be associated to multiple hazards.
Yes.
And therefore, you won't have, duplication in that regard. But if we simply look at it in saying, we've got a small list of controls for a very long list of hazards, and we still decide to remove things as control measures, just understand what you're exposing the people to. Definitely. And then ask yourself the moral question of whether that's okay. I even ask the question, what if it were you?
Yeah, fully agree.
What if it was you doing the work? And another person had a decision to make as to whether you had an opportunity to be safe or not. And that person decides not to take the opportunity to keep you safe. How would you feel? Would you want to work?
Yeah. Well, no.
I wouldn't want to do the work.
Definitely not.
Yeah, I mean, that just comes down to the duty to care. It's a moral question.
Definitely.
And it has to be answered by every employer. Like it should be answered by every employee, because an employee can hurt another employee as well.
True.
And I mean, that again comes back to the way that we think about health and safety, which isn't thought of properly in many places by many employers and by many people.
True. And again, that contributes to one of our earlier discussions. Have those policies and procedures in place, go above and beyond just simply ticking boxes, simply putting the bare minimum requirements in just for window dressing. Look at the moral obligations as well and ask yourself these difficult questions. And if you start asking these difficult questions, you might be surprised with the answers. Well, that being said, Orchid, there's just one more thing that I want to discuss here very quickly while we're on the topic of hazard risks and control measures. My next question to you is now that we have all of these controls, we have these hazards and the scoring, how do we measure their effectiveness? So we've now implemented all of these control measures beautifully. I have a section 8, I have a whole file with appointment letters, a whole file with training, a file with attendance registers of all my SOP communications. How do we know that this is actually serving a purpose and controlling or mitigating that particular hazard? How do we test these lot?
Well, if you were coaching a football team, or if you were coaching a rugby team, or any team for that matter, that's your preparation for the match, right? The only way you're going to see whether your coaching was effective is to get them on the field and to go and have a look. Right. Are they scoring tries? Are they scoring goals or are they losing? Are there gaps open for the other team to hit through your defense, your layers of defense that you have here, and for you to get hurt and lose the match? You've got to literally get up from your desk, fill out a control measure checklist, do a job safety analysis, have conversations with the employees, get the supervisors and the managers involved as well, because they are accountable for the safety of the employee doing the work as much as you may be as a health and safety professional as well.
Yeah.
And that's the only way. And then you've got to take the feedback, information that you get, again, leaving open the door for the possibility that you may be wrong, and that's an opportunity, and make the necessary adjustments, get back on the floor, re-implement, re-communicate, re-evaluate, check again, and bring that feedback, again, bring it back to your system, which you're working on here. And if you need to make further adjustments, you do that as well. Risk management isn't a once-off process. It's not something that you do once and then you're done. Just like you don't complete a risk assessment and leave it on the shelf and then think that you're okay. Yeah, it's a continual process. It's a process of continual improvement. And again, if you think about, and we can ask the viewers out there as well, if you think about incidents and accidents that you are aware of, and if you just sit back and think about the opportunities that exist and existed to stop those incidents from happening, why were they not applied? Why not?
Yeah, and that's a very valid question, but I can already see the argument starting to form here. Oh, I didn't have time. Oh, there wasn't budget for it. Oh, this, oh, that. Those are the most common questions, and I can promise you if I ask that question, I can speak on behalf of certain people when it comes to that. But again, that brings us back to what we spoke about earlier on. If there is a specific control that you cannot implement beyond reasonably practicable standards, we need to adjust our risk assessment and we need to look at alternatives. It is not good enough to just say, oh, well, I didn't have time, I didn't have budget, so be it, let's just adjust the score and I'll live with it. Again, morally speaking, that's not how we're supposed to do things. You need to look at alternatives. If you cannot substitute or eliminate something, at the very least, look at what else we can do, what other layers of defense we can put into place. Again, like your connotation with the rugby team, maybe subsidize one player for another, maybe try a different technique, maybe try a different way of doing things. Those are all things to consider as well.
Yes, I mean, the excuses that you use now, well, let's call them justifications, right?
Sure.
Or for why something is not being done properly. Mm-hmm. That's all they are. Mm-hmm. They're justifications. It's a way to get around the moral question, first of all, and then secondly the legal
accountability, and responsibility. That's the thing.
If someone tells me I didn't have the time to apply this control measure, well, I don't think that they planned properly. If someone says that they don't have enough money, I don't think that they really considered the scope of work that they're doing and the scope and application of health and safety as it relates to their business properly, so they didn't budget properly. Mm-hmm. So take responsibility and plan properly, take responsibility and budget properly, and do it right. And I mean, there are tools and mechanisms out there to make it easy for you to do. I mean, if you're considering budgeting, go on to mysafetyshop.co.za if you're a company in South Africa and you need help, and open the cart, add the items that you need to the cart, and you're going to have a total amount for all your training and medicals and risk assessments and audits and everything that you need. And you take that amount and you divide it by 12, and you have a minimum budgeted amount that you need to start off with.
So, as I've mentioned, time is one of the worst excuses or justifications, in my opinion. We have various tools or mechanisms available to speed up that processes. One of the practical examples I can give to you is when I ask an employer to develop an SOP, for example. Yes, we have an SOP utilizing OSH Online and it pulls through via the risk assessment. But even if you do not have access to a management system like OSH Online, there are various other AI model platforms available. Utilize them. Wally from Safety Wallet, there is a free version available for Wally as well that is specifically designed around health and safety legislative requirements and how to build certain things. You can quite literally ask Wally, please do an SOP on conducting welding operations, and it will give that SOP to you. So again, time is really a relevant term. There are easier and faster ways to do things.
No, I think, there's a solution to be found for whatever question you have if you're willing to look for it. Mm-hmm. And that's risk management. That's what it is.
Yeah.
You are consistently looking for solutions to problems. And the problem is, those possible consequences that can come about. And you got to find a way to plug that hole. And you got to find a way to put tape over it. You got to find a way to get someone to stand guard over it. Mm-hmm. You got to find a way to make sure that person is managed and that they understand why they're standing guard over it. And I'm using a simple example, but essentially it comes down to the same thing. Mm-hmm. And I think in the episodes to follow, we're going to look at a lot of controls, their validity. We're going to look at, how they should be applied, what they mean, what they look like, which I'm excited for, because that's the kind of information I feel that we can bring to our viewers. And again, if you guys out there, if you have questions or suggestions on what it is you want us to explore, we're willing to take the time and to put in the time to explore it for you. So drop a comment.
Thank you very much for your insights, Okkert. I feel this was a very fruitful session. We started off the conversation very strong, and I think we can build on this very strong foundation moving forward. And as you've now mentioned, if you are a viewer and you have any questions or any queries or any insights into this matter, please drop a comment down below. But Okkert, thank you very much for your time. I'm looking forward to our next session. And then for the viewers, as always, stay safe, stay inspired, and until next time, take care.
Cheers.